Thank you and good evening. I apologise to those of you who were misled by an invitation stating that I'd be delivering a keynote address. This was an isolated slip by Andrew Smorchevsky's otherwise excellent editorial team. But I will offer you a keyhole view of the thematic edition, encouraging you to enter in and read for yourselves the wonderful scholarship inside. This correction is a bit like the wonderful put-down recounted to me by Sir Anthony Mason. An unnamed Solicitor General once indicated to the High Court that he had concluded the first branch of his argument. Twig would be a more appropriate word, Mr. Solicitor, would it not? Was the retort of Mr. Justice Menzies. Thematic editions of law reviews have been around a long time, but until the last decade, no commonality would have been perceived in 4 articles on property law, the equitable doctrine of election, the history of unjust enrichment, and the place of statutes in the legal system. What could possibly link these topics spanning public and private law, obligations and remedies, law and equity, history and legal theory, statute and general law? Of course, conceptual coherence is the melody sounding throughout this issue, with 2 alternative forms of coherence serving contrapuntal roles. The alternatives are coherence with logic and coherence with history, in other words, precedent. They are vertical in nature, whereas conceptual coherence is a more horizontal form of rationality. Those who, in Justice Hayden's words, exercise the judicial power of developing the law, maintaining its continuity, and preserving its coherence, will draw on all 3 forms of coherence, not invariably and not necessarily consistently, whatever consistency means, as between 3 different modalities. Justice Mark Leeming reminds us in his article that logic has not always been the life of the common law, according to Holmes's famous aphorism, and that legislators have never been constrained by orthodoxy of any kind. As for historical coherence based on the force of precedents, even canonical decisions will at times have their reasoning questioned, overturned, ignored, or reinterpreted, as Warren Swain demonstrates when analysing the fates of Moses and McFarlane in different jurisdictions and different eras. In 2001, the High Court of Australia welcomed conceptual coherence as a tool of judicial method when explaining in Sullivan and Moody that decisions about the existence, nature and scope of a duty of care might be influenced by, quote, the need to preserve the coherence of legal principles or of a statutory scheme which governs certain conduct or relationships. This analytical tool has since been employed on numerous occasions to justify limiting or expanding the scope of legal categories and maintaining or redrawing historical lines in the law. Coherence has helped resolve tensions between principles where both are found in the general law, where both stem from ostensibly conflicting statutes, and where one derives from the general law and another is constitutional or statutory. Enthusiasm about coherence as between legal and equitable doctrines has been much more muted in our High Court, in contrast to its counterparts in England, New Zealand and the United States. Mark Leeming's article resolves not even think of going into the F or fusion word. I do not intend to forswear in such fulsome tones, but since I have much the easier side in this ongoing debate, I'll keep fairly quiet about it on this occasion. The jurisprudence of the American realists, and closer to home the teachings of Professors Julius Stone and Martin Krieger, exposed the fictions and fallacies of much that used to be passed off as strict legalism in the law of precedent. Recent backsliding under the banner of a purely bottom-up incrementalist approach to precedents has been, in my opinion, unprincipled and selective. Even incrementalists will be confronted with deciding what is an increment too far, in the words of Lord Justice Beldam. They are then forced to look upwards to broad theories or outwards to alternative categories when making inevitable choices. Hopefully those choices are informed by appreciation of enduring values and policies lying beneath the historical formulae or divisions. Those choices may also involve deciding whether or not to allow plaintiffs to run alternative claims, for example, claims in contract and unjust enrichment. In contrast to Pavey and Matthews, the alternative restitutionary claim was denied in the recent Equus Corp case, where Professor Birks's notion of stultification was invoked to explain why the illegality policy that struck down a contractual claim also precluded resort to restitution for unjust enrichment. I perceive that stultification is want of conceptual coherence under a different label. Striving for coherence requires the lawyers who teach, research, apply and develop written and unwritten law to perceive the true, yet often shifting location of cases and statutes. The common law may be more like a muddle than a system, in A.W.B. Simpson's words quoted by Justice Leeming, but its rules, categories and concepts need to be understood relative to one another if they are to be taught clearly and applied consistently, and if categories of equal justice are to be met. Rules, categories and concepts may be the artificial constructs of academics and judges, but they also serve vital functions in suggesting the limits of a proposition, the exceptions it carries, and where it possibly intersects with other propositions. Any case or statutory provision needs to find its conceptual location by means other than the alphabet, a section number, or a medium neutral citation reference. The meaning and authority of a decision and the meaning of a statute will often depend on how it fits within a changing legal landscape. It's little help to know that Donoghue and Stevenson involved a snail or even a tort. Even placing this landmark case in a category called negligence is now rather fraught. That's because the High Court in Dedera's case has said that the duty of care owed to highway and bridge users has a different scope than that owed to Mrs. Donoghue, in that, as a matter of law, the scope of the Dedera duty must account for the exercise of reasonable care by road users themselves. Taxonomy means no more than classification or grouping. In life, science, and the law, categories and concepts are grouped and separated as the human mind gropes for understanding and guidance for future conduct. We are uncomfortable with chaos and randomness. So, in order to understand, explain, or teach something of importance, we make lists, frequently overlapping lists. In law, this serves an additional role of helping to achieve consistency and fairness. Recent heightened concern about coherence and interest in legal taxonomy go hand in hand. Much activity on both fronts stems from the sometimes controversial work of the late Professor Peter Birks, who devised a map of the entire legal landscape while expounding a law of restitution that was stripped of the fiction of implied contract and supplemented by topics previously parked under equity or admiralty. Birks's aim was to show that an unjust enrichment concept was rooted in both historical and rational coherence, and generally unaffected by what he saw as a largely incoherent law-equity divide. The taxonomy wars have, in my opinion, been marked by a degree of overstatement by both supporters and detractors of the debate. Birks may have offered a highly contestable roadmap of the whole of private law, and his rigid demarcation between property and obligations, coupled with an entirely non-remedial role for the constructive trust, is still playing havoc in England. But his call for the Academy and the judiciary to think about mapping and to contest inaccurate or unhelpful maps in the law will be the enduring legacy of this latter-day Blackstone. It's always been easy to deride the utility of some of Birks's lists and mathematical quadrations. There's nothing new in this. Mr Justice Fulliger warned about avoiding the temptation to import a meretricious symmetry into the law. Sir Victor Windeyer once derided a submission in a constitutional case that disputes are either industrial or not industrial by remarking, "That is logically incontestable, and like Sinclair's well-known division of sleeping in two sorts, namely sleeping with or sleeping without a nightcap, it would seem to exhaust the subject." But disputes over particular taxonomies should not degenerate into attacks on systematisation itself, lest we return to the formalistic fictional world of the forms of action. Law must remain subject to academic scrutiny, even if some of the scrutineers are strident or make some assertions that fail to gain general assent. Peter Birks and William Gummow seem to have disagreed on several fronts, but each in his own way was a champion for transparent thinking and non-fictional legal discourse. Unhelpful terms like quasi-contract, damages, agent, and non-delegable duty had no place in their landscape. Each jurist, however, tended to throw caution to the winds when entering the taxonomical territories of equity and unjust enrichment, so jealously guarded by the other. For each man, as he supported his pet field and attacked the opposing intruder, the contributions were marked by somewhat over-inclusive claims of rationality, coherence and utility, or the opposite in the case of the person being detracted. It's pleasing to note that to adopt a pleading term, issue has been more clearly joined by the High Court in Boffinger and Kingsway Group and in Equus Corp. Birks was sometimes attacked for his resort to metaphors and analogies drawn from nature. Law is not a science, thundered the critics. I'm not very happy with this rhetorical dichotomy in this context. Even if law and nature stood still, the complexity of each lies well beyond the grasp of any one person or one generation. And each object of study has such practical importance that it cries out for more, not less, academic analysis. And as with the mysteries of God and the universe, the fallible observers of each needs must turn to metaphors, analogies, and ever-contestable concepts to expound what they may think they understand, but inevitably have to confront one way or another. It's unsurprising that taxonomy wars are not peculiar to lawyers. In an article called "Viruses Are Real, Virus Species Are Man-Made Taxonomic Constructions," Professor Van Regenmortel wrote, "Scientists are a real person, not a..." I believe. Scientists are committed to the study of real, tangible objects and tend to rely on facts rather than speculation. This steadfast commitment to the real world partly explains the reluctance of some scientists to become involved in classifying the objects they study. Classifications tend to be perceived as purely conceptual constructions of the mind, useful for bringing some semblance of order into the bewildering variety of natural phenomena, but essentially arbitrary and unworthy of serious attention by scientists engaged in the study of nature. As stated by Mill, many are bored by taxonomy because they think it means spending a lifetime on whether a certain kind of beetle has 5 hairs on its bottom or 7, and then splitting the hairs. Let me mention briefly the particular chapters of the thematic issue that I'm honoured to launch. Mark Leeming contends strongly that statutes are an underappreciated component in the academic literature on the Australian legal system, indeed the elephant in the room. Leeming's thesis is that statutes are neglected, even or especially in areas derived exclusively from judge-made law. This neglect stems from the lingering legacy of late 19th century Langdellianism. This was an academic movement which replaced the alphabetical ordering of the digests with rigid constructs designed for undergraduates at a time when non-conforming decisions could be easily brushed aside and hopefully forgotten. Since enacted law is the the critical driver of change and restraint in the Australian legal system, Leaming's words and emphasis, ignorance of statutes is nothing short of willful blindness for the practitioner and the scholar. The relationship between statutes and what is left of common law is complex and symbiotic. This is not to say that it's chaotic, although Mark's paper is a wake-up call to academics, including academic judges, to lift their game in researching and propounding the ways in which conceptual coherence affects statutory interpretation and how cases and statutes impact on each other. Leaming has himself made a major contribution to this enterprise in his work Resolving Conflicts of Laws. The articles by Warren Swain on unjust enrichment and Chiao Liu on equitable election show that while statutory impacts vary in their intensity across the law, the need for sound practical taxonomies is universal. Where Parliament keeps away, there's by definition more scope for case law, even ancient case law, to retain sway taxonomically and otherwise. But the forms of action are now blessedly almost silent, and as indicated already, even leading cases need a conceptual framework. That framework may become contestable over time due to many factors. For a precedent to endure, to be developed, or even to be overruled, it must be possible to explicate what it currently stands for in propositional, that is, conceptual terms. Swain traces the reception of the unjust enrichment concept in the United States, England and Australia. Probably the earliest citing was in an 1802 commentary based on Lord Mansfield's judgment in Moses and Macfarlane. In the United States, the concept was always viewed as the product of Mansfield's felicitous blending of legal and equitable ideas, and it was nurtured as such by American judges and scholars throughout the 19th century. The flowering of this scholarship is the recent restatement on restitution and unjust enrichment, on which the High Court drew recently in Equus Corp. In England and Australia, by contrast, the 2 centuries since 1760 saw Mansfield's avowedly fusionist vision being variously castigated, dismissed and then ignored. All this changed when the demands of conceptual coherence, sans fictions, extirpated implied contract from the law of quasi-contract, creating a vacuum that helped suck Lord Mansfield back into centre stage. By this time, the unjust enrichment concept, mainly re-imported via the restatement, had been developed by Gough, Jones and Burks, each of whom detected its outworking in additional fields of law, equity and admiralty. But as Swain demonstrates, differences across the jurisdictions quickly opened up in the 21st century. These were fuelled by controversies about taxonomy itself, the conceptual bases for restitution, the place of equity within it, and the roles of scholars and theories in that debate. Chiao Liu examines the concept of election in both legal and equitable discourse. Examining the case law, he identifies a general theory of election that binds all similar acts of choice into a conceptual unity. He sees there to be 4 constituent elements: a communicated unilateral act involving a choice between alternative inconsistent options that is informed, conscious and deliberate, and 4, a consequential finality in that the election is binding and irrevocable. This 4th element, he argues, illustrates the normative conception of the doctrine of election that he describes, in the sense of being an internally rationalised system that furnishes in itself a justification or explanation for the irrevocability of the choice. Liu acknowledges that some decisions about election point to a different taxonomy, particularly cases illustrating equitable election. His words. In this alternative universe, the normative conception explaining the outcome of cases involving the first 3 elements is to be found outside the general theory of election already described. Liu argues that the case law shows that the bindingness of the party's choice turns upon better anchored doctrines and concepts such as estoppel and benefit retention. Equitable election is therefore to be excluded from the general theory out of the considerations of, quote, rationality and justice. Paul Baby calls for an organising theme that truly depicts property in its Australian context. For him, property is best understood as sovereignty, itself a public law concept. It's both a state grant of power over scarce goods and resources and a means of ensuring that the individual's control does not bear detrimental outcomes for the common welfare of a society. This conceptualising permits one to see a unity in seemingly unrelated topics such as Crown land, Indigenous land rights, personal property, commercial property, security interests, intellectual property, water resources, minerals, and the human genome. Baby's particular bogies are reasoning that's ahistorical in the form of irrelevant English land law, failure to understand the full implications of the Crown's radical sovereignty in Australia, and property law being taught as, quote, a loose collection of largely English subtopics without any unifying theme, and as, quote, simply a set of arcane historical black-letter rules. Baby's justification for the exercise are pedagogical and, quote, theoretical, unquote. No criticisms intended when I observe that this places his article at a different point on a spectrum dealing with theoretical and practical jurisprudence when compared with the other three. But this tension is as old as time itself, and wrestling with it remains as important as ever. Each of the articles shows why the Academy and the Court must continue to speak and listen to each other. Even if one knows where to start looking for the law in an area, some conceptual index or map is needed, not necessarily one covering the whole of the law. However, not all maps are appropriate or up to date. Not all concepts are authoritative or useful. Some, including the label equitable, are overbroad, to use an Americanism. The boundaries of some categories overlap, necessitating decisions whether or not to allow alternative claims or defences. In the world where law is practice, legal propositions will be tested and contested, sometimes by jurists relatively insouciant of legal history or the scope of the concepts they use by instinct, sometimes by legislators who don't care at all. This said, striving for rationality in all its forms remains a most human trait. Its attainment, as far as practicable, is an aspect of justice itself. Thank you.